I want to thank Barry Murphy, who is with us today. It was Barry who framed the question that became the title of our research study: what would be required for nuclear energy plants to be operating in Australia from the 2030s? It's the longer we worked on this study, the more I realised how brilliant that question is. It takes us beyond the question of the current situation with the bans and so forth that have been talked about a little bit this morning, and challenges us to imagine a future that we could then focus on describing. So it actually all started with a lunch where Barry challenged me to think about doing a study of this type. And in thinking about how to answer such an enormous question, I decided we needed to break it down into a number of parts. And initially, we came up with, I came up with 7 topic areas, and then during the course of the study realised that there was an 8th one that we'd overlooked at the outset, which we added in. So this couldn't have been done by any one person, and we brought together a team of student researchers to help with the initial research, and also some mentors, some postgrad mentors, one of whom, Hasliza Omar, is with us today in the room. Thank you, Hasliza. And of course, the industry experts who worked on this study with us. I think several of these people are here with us. Tony is here with us. Helen Cook is here, and Martin Thomas is here in the room as well. Martin was one of the very diligent proofreaders of the report. So thank you to all of those people. So that's the scope of our study. It's the 7 that became 8 topics, and then the context in which we set it. So what I want to do this morning is just sort of take you through at a fairly high level each of those topic areas that we looked at in answering the question. And John Harries tells me that there is a pile of these reports just outside the room. So if you'd like to have an old school glossy hard copy, please feel free to pick that up. That's courtesy of the University of Queensland that carried the cost of publishing this. Thank you to Professor Aidan Byrne. And if you would also like a soft copy perhaps to distribute to other people, that is available on the University of Queensland website. So I think the context is really important for answering this question. You know, what would be required for nuclear energy plants to be operating from the 2030s? Well, what does the power system, the energy system that we've got in Australia today look like? And what would we expect it to look like 10 plus years from now? So this is taken from figure 1 in the study report. This is the left-hand slice of that figure. And what this is showing is the installed generating capacity that we have in the Eastern Australian grid. So most of the opportunity is in Eastern Australia. I believe there are also opportunities in Western Australia, but the systems, plural, in WA are much smaller than the national electricity market in the east. So here you basically see the existing brown coal at the bottom, and then black coal plants in Victoria, and then New South Wales and Queensland. And then after that, the next dark blue colour up around the 30 gigawatt line is gas-fired steam plant in South Australia, and then gas combined cycle plant, and then that sort of greenish colour is the hydro, that's the large hydro plant, and then open cycle gas turbines, the dark blue, and then above that some liquid fuel engines and turbines, and then the wind farms and solar farms right up there at the top. So that's what our system looks like. The installed capacity is a little over 50 gigawatts, and the dispatchable fraction of that is about in the low 40s. And that system is meeting a peak demand that varies between 30 and 35 gigawatts, depending on basically on how hot the summer is. Usually we peak in the summer, although the winter's not too far behind. What is going to happen as we roll this forward? Let's roll this forward. So the big story is that the brown coal and black coal plants are no spring chickens. They're getting older, they're going to retire. And so those first two data series there that you see stepping down between 2022 and 2050, that represents the current expectation of the retirement schedule of those 16 coal-fired power plants in Victoria, in New South Wales, and in Queensland. So we go from about 23 gigawatts of coal-fired baseload plants down to nothing by just after 2050. Now, some of those, since this chart was compiled, there have been some announcements about some of those plants retiring even earlier than had been previously expected. So the rate of decline of that series is currently slightly faster than what you're seeing there. Then you also see above that the gas combined cycle plants retiring and also the open cycle gas turbine plants. The large hydro plants have very long lives, and we would expect those to continue right through to 2060 and beyond. Notice also that the wind and solar capacity at the top, this is the large grid-connected solar farms and the wind farms, also have relatively short, much shorter lives, in fact, than the coal plants. So by 2050, all of that existing capacity, basically all the capacity that we've got today, except for Snowy Hydro and the other hydro plants, will no longer be in operation unless it's had some sort of very major refurbishment. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So essentially the opportunity for nuclear is that gap that's created by the retirement of those plants that were built to underpin the system and that are still today performing that job of keeping the lights on. That's the context that we're working in. And so we're talking about a fleet. I think we need a fleet of nuclear plants that's at least 10 gigawatts and probably as much as 20 or even more, if we want to, particularly if we want to have a large electrification strategy for doing things like decarbonising transport. Okay, so the first topic we looked at in our study was technology. The question we asked is, well, what kind of technology would be appropriate for Australia to deploy nuclear energy? And given the time and the resources for a preliminary concept study of this nature, we were not able to do a full in-depth assessment of all possible designs and technology variants. We came quickly to the view that large gigawatt scale nuclear power plants would not be appropriate for Australia. They'd be larger than the largest unit currently on the system, which is the 750 megawatt Kogan Creek plant in Queensland. And I believe that those scale of units are just too big for Australia. However, we came to the view that small modular reactor plants would be much more suitable and appropriate for Australian conditions, and we decided to focus on the design that is currently most advanced down the development path within this category of technology, and that's the NuScale small modular reactor design and plant. What you see here on the right-hand side of the diagram is a cutaway of a single module from that design, about 23 metres high, which is located in a pool of water. And that unit is, the power output from a single one of those units is 77 megawatts of electrical power. It's designed to drive its own single steam turbine. And that design there is basically licensed and ready to build in the United States. It has behind it over 20 years of engineering research and development, and something like $1.3 billion US of R&D funding has been invested in that design to take it from its original concept in the Oregon State University all the way through to a commercial design that's been approved by the US regulator. Each of those modules is located in a pool of water, as you see on the left, in the main reactor building. They're brought in on the left through the loading bay. You can see a module there lying down horizontally. It's then lowered into position and moved into its bay, and then each module is moved for the refueling process. There are now a number of strategic investors in NuScale, the first of which was Fluor. We've got a representative of Fluor with us in the room today. I would also like to thank people on within NuScale and within Fluor who helped us in the course of this study in making sure we understood the technology correctly and described it correctly. So basically the big message here is that there exists technology, and this is one of several possible designs that could be adopted in Australia. There exists technology that within the time frame we're talking about, 2030 plus, could be adopted by Australia and deployed in Australia so that we could have nuclear energy in our system. Next question is engineering project management. So, you know, when we're talking about technology like this, it's not like going down to the showroom and buying a new car, being given the keys and driving away. There's a much more sophisticated set of skills are required to actually take that technology and deploy it in a real project. And so the framework that we used in the study is the engineering project life cycle. And the key message here is that in order to get to the point by about 2030 or soon after where Australia would be ready to actually build a real project, there's a whole lot of sequential work that would need to happen building up to that. And so the very first stage of that process is indeed a preliminary concept study, and we've done the preliminary concept study. Then there's a sequence of steps that need to proceed following that. And the rule of thumb here is that with each subsequent step, the amount of resource that you'll need to commit is approximately 10 times the resource of the previous step. Okay, so if we think that one of these plants on the scale of 900 or so, approaching 1,000 megawatts, would represent on the order of $5 billion of capital, round numbers, just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude. Then the stage before that, the feasibility study, is probably about a tenth of that. Okay, so about $500 million, $500 million. The step before that, the pre-feasibility study, is probably like a $50 million exercise, and the scoping study is a $5 million exercise. So because we had university resources, we were able to do this in a very, very frugal way, but this represents, let's say, something on the order of $500,000 of value to get to this stage. So what we're looking at the next big stage is the scoping study, and then step by step to get to the point where a real project is ready to go to financing around the 2030 timeframe. That's the process that we'd be looking at. That's all described in chapter 2 of the study. Next big topic is governance. Clearly, this is a licensed activity. In fact, to build any power station, if you just want to go and connect a small diesel power plant to the national grid, that's a licensed activity. You can't just rock up and plug yourself in, right? You've got to get a whole lot of approvals and licenses in order to do that. And nuclear, obviously, there's some extra layers on top of that. The good news is that the sort of bare bones of the architecture of the governance system that's needed exists because we have in Australia a research reactor. We are an active nuclear country. We are a member, we're a founding member, as our nation is a founding member of the International Atomic Energy Agency dating from the 1950s, and we're a signatory of all the various treaties that govern responsible use of nuclear technology and nuclear materials. Within Australia itself, there are various acts of parliament that are relevant to this topic area. There are various Commonwealth bodies. A number of those have been mentioned earlier. ASNO and ARPANSA have already been mentioned. Also, the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency, which is establishing the facility at Kimber, has been mentioned. ANSTO, of course, has been mentioned. And then when we come onto the energy side of things, there's a number of Commonwealth bodies, both corporations like the Snowy Corporation also has been mentioned, and and of course regulatory and other bodies. So it is a complex landscape. A lot of the elements are there. We are not geared up as a nation to regulate energy producing nuclear facilities yet. We would need to build that capability. And one of the key messages from this chapter is that it's not just a question of repealing the bans in the various acts of parliament. We should also sit down and think in a very systematic way about the whole set of legal reform processes that are required to put our legal and regulatory instruments on a footing where they're suitable for a fleet of nuclear energy plants to be operating in Australia. So there's a work stream that needs to be done there. Next question is capabilities, and there have been some questions already flagged about capabilities. I have to admit, with some embarrassment, that when I started this research, I thought that this would probably be too advanced, too complicated, too challenging and too difficult for Australia. As a result of doing this study, I've now become completely convinced that we can do this. We can acquire, develop, train, plan and build the human capabilities needed to actually have a fleet of nuclear energy plants operating in Australia a decade from now. We will need to strengthen the institutions. There will be more people needed in that area. Companies will need to enhance their capability. Universities will need to scale up their teaching and research activities. And then in local workforces, people will need to be trained and re-skilled. But you know, when you look at our legacy fleet of coal-fired power plants in places like the Latrobe Valley, that photograph on the right is the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, or the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. There are a lot of people there with a lot of skills who can be retrained to work in a nuclear sector. It's not the case that every single engineer in a nuclear power plant needs to be a specialist nuclear engineer. There's a need for engineers right across the discipline set. Some of those engineers will be trained with extra complementary skills, you know, an extra module here or there that's nuclear specific, in addition to the specialised nuclear engineers that we will need. So with forethought and planning, I'm sure that we can cover off the capability requirements. And I think that one of the key messages that needs to be repeated is that we're talking here about long-term, sustainable, high-quality employment in an industry of this nature, not just short-term construction jobs, for example. This is the topic that I'd overlooked at the start of the study, the importance of public trust, the importance of society. Helen has touched on it. Previous speaker, David and Andrew, have both touched on the importance of this topic. It's really, really important that a nuclear industry has the strong support of the society as a whole, and that support needs to continue through the project cycle, so through all the years of planning and approvals right up to the date of the decision to actually build a plant, and then through construction, and then through decades of operation. This is the kind of support that you can't afford to flip-flop on the change of government from one election to the next, for example. It needs to be very deep and very sustained. And building that is part of the work of the 2020s. You know, someone needs to be taking responsibility to build that support. And part of that is the communication process. So the role that ANSTO plays is crucial. You know, I'll tell you a little small anecdote. I met the guy who drove me to the New South Wales parliamentary inquiry. Was an older gentleman from India. I think he'd been born in India. I said, "Tell me, should Australia embrace nuclear energy?" He said, "Oh yes, of course." I said, "Really? Why do you say that?" He said, "Well, you know," he said, "my wife had cancer and she was treated with nuclear medicine from ANSTO, and I don't think there's anything to be afraid of." I said, "Wow, thank you for sharing that with me." So there must be, you know, hundreds or thousands of these little stories scattered out there among the community, and maybe there are even people who've benefited who didn't fully realise where this was coming from. So I think, you know, all of these things are part of the story of making sure that people have high quality information and they understand. It's not about trying to educate people the way that you would educate a nuclear engineer. You know, when we walk down the air bridge and step onto an aircraft, for people like me, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I understand, you know, on a reasonable level how that aircraft works and why I should feel safe, and that the air pressure difference between the upper and the lower surface is just equivalent to a baby sucking on a straw. You know, it's not going to fall out of the sky. But most people will come to their trust and their appreciation of the technology in a completely different way. And so that's why I think there's actually an analogy here between this industry and the aircraft industry. You know, what is it that makes people feel safe getting on an aircraft? You know, it's all these same things. It's trust in the industry in general. It's trust in the designs. You know, you're trusting in Boeing or Airbus. You're trusting in all those technology vendors that have made all the parts and the companies that have put it all together. You're trusting that the regulators have put the airport in a sensible, safe place. That the skills of all the people, from the people in the cockpit to the people in the maintenance hangar, are really first rate. And that behind all that, there's a governance structure that's clear and transparent and not corrupt, and that it's trustworthy. So I think, you know, that's how people trust in high technology that they don't understand on an engineering level, and I think it's just exactly the same in the nuclear industry. Where would we put these things? We didn't, in this study, we obviously weren't doing a site selection process, but the most important thing to understand about siting from the point of view of this technology is that it's very compact and it doesn't need enormous emergency planning zones like the traditional gigawatt scale reactors. So essentially the emergency planning zone shrinks to the site boundary of the plant itself. So the snapshot there in the top left is an artist's impression of the NuScale plant. That central building is the building with the pool and the reactors in. And just to give a sense of scale, this is an aerial photograph of the University of Queensland on the Brisbane River. And that blue rectangle in the middle there is about the size of the Great Court at UQ from one side to the other. It's about twice the length of an Olympic swimming pool and about 9 times the depth, and then the other buildings would be clustered around that. So you get a sense that the amount of land footprint that's needed for this technology is actually very compact, and that actually creates a whole lot of optionality and choice in site selection. Economics is a topic that has become almost like topic number one in the discussion of nuclear energy. It's probably the most surprising thing for me, having seen the process of the 3 parliamentary inquiries, was that the number of anti-nuclear people that were not willing to sort of really come out and say they were anti-nuclear, but that were just sort of throwing up what I think are essentially bogus economic arguments, really struck me. And so when you look at the economics, it's important to understand that the way that this new emerging generation of technology has been conceived and designed is very different from the old large-scale plants. And one of the most important aspects is the flexibility of the technology to adapt to variable output from renewable generation on the same system, as well as variability of electricity demand. And what we're finding, I have to admit, when I first heard this, I was super skeptical about it. What we're now finding in research modelling work that we're doing at the University of Queensland, supported through the Sir William Tyree Scholarship that was mentioned just a moment ago, we're finding that this technology, properly modelled with its ramp rates and generation unit commitment constraints, properly modelled for the whole eastern electricity market, fits in absolutely beautifully with wind and solar. If you try and decarbonise, the short answer is, if you try and decarbonise the whole of the Australian electricity grid just with wind and solar, my view, it's probably just going to fall over technically and not work at all. But if you can get it to work, it's going to be staggeringly expensive. when you allow small modular reactors into the system, the picture completely changes. One of the very interesting things is that the model still wants a modest amount of wind and solar in the grid, and then it works in a complementary way with this technology. This is a fascinating conclusion, and the rigour of the modelling work that we're doing goes beyond what's in this paper here, but it essentially confirms what this paper from 2015 was saying. This is just modelling it inside the nuclear plant itself. So one of the cool things the NuScale guys did is they went to future customers and they said, what do you need? And they said, well, we've got old coal plants and we've got wind farms. We can't build new coal to replace the old coal. We need something that's going to, we know that old style nuclear won't work with the wind. What can you do? And so that's the reason that this technology's been designed the way that it has. So coming to financing, we use the Association for the Advancement of Cost Economics methodology to take into account the full range of uncertainty with respect to future technology. Okay, it's years out. We've got a mix of Class 3 and Class 4 estimates. We've done some conversions from US to Australian conditions, and we're basically saying, you know, the central estimate's $5.8 billion for a new plant. That's a 12-module NuScale plant. I'm saying here that we probably should be aiming to hit that level with about a sort of fifth of a kind in the series. First plant's probably going to be more like $7 to $8 or $9 billion. And in the long run, with nth of a kind, we should be targeting $5 or $4 billion of capital cost. And then you can see in the last row there what that translates to in terms of long run average cost of energy. Okay, so if you're going to write a 30-year contract to pay back the capital on a plant like this at 7%, what is it? Sorry, a 5.3% discount rate, you'd need to be charging, in the central case, $76 a megawatt hour. But even in the worst case, it's 100. So this is like realistic energy cost. It's a key message. So in our forward, please read the forward by Peter Varghese. He says we must be prepared critically to examine the various options. Given the uncertainty that's in front of all of us and the current debate and diversity of views, what does that mean? It means that we need to create real options. So whether or not we actually deploy nuclear energy, we're not making a decision today to press a button and deploy. We're creating the options so that we can make that decision. And we've got to compile those options into a plan. Now, the problem we've got in Australia at the moment, we don't have a plan B. This quote here is from a paper by Bob Pritchard in the International Energy Law Review, which draws our attention to the fact that the G20 leaders are seeing these problems. The G20 leaders are seeing that there's this increasing share of intermittent energy, growing demand for storage, need for system flexibility, sustainable supply chains, right, the need for technological solutions. So even at the G20 leaders level, they're starting to see these problems with trying to decarbonise using only wind and solar. And you've got to notice that items 2, 3, 4 and 5 on that list there are a direct result of item 1. So if you just keep piling wind and solar onto the grid, you're going to create all these problems. However, if you open up to nuclear, then all these problems basically go away, right? So at the moment, we're putting all our eggs in the Plan A basket. The ISP is Plan A version 1, Plan B, Plan A version 2, Plan A version 3. You know, can have a bit more batteries or a bit less pumped hydro, or you can retire the coal plant a little bit faster or a little bit slower, have a few more. It's all the same thing, guys. It's all the same thing, right? It's only Plan A. And it's just completely nuts. We need to have a Plan B. Like, maybe Plan A works. In Plan A, we decarbonise the whole system with wind and solar and we all live happily ever after. Usually people live happily ever after in a fairy story. Okay, but I'll grant you, maybe that'll work, and if it does, well done. We can all celebrate. But I think we need to have a Plan B. That's a balanced mix of technologies, and if we don't have that, then we're going to end up with chaotic coal refurbs or desperate default to diesel, basically third world conditions. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think we're about halfway, a third to halfway along on the social maturation curve. The next step is the education and engagement that I talked about, and getting that scoping study up and running. And that's the popularisation and responding to the challenge. And when we achieve that, then we can have the governance changes we need and this can all become normal. Thank you very much.